This is Al Black with Chewing the Gristle and my co-host, Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
How you doing, my brother, Al?
Well, it's a great day, and our subject for the interview today is the poet and educator, Esperanza Snyder. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you guys today.
Esperanza, also known as originally as Hope Maxwell Snyder, was born and raised in Bogotá, Colombia. She earned a BA in English from the College of William and Mary, an MA in Spanish literature from George Washington University, an MA in Latin American literature from the Johns Hopkins University, and a PhD in Spanish medieval literature from the University of Manchester in England. She is the author of Esperanza and Hope, 2018. Her poems and translations have appeared in Alehouse Press, the Comstock Review, the Gettysburg Review, Kenyon Review, International Poetry Review, Osho, Poetry Northwest, Redactions, Poetry and Poetics, and many other journals. Again, welcome, Esperanza Snyder.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about your poetry journey and who were your early influences and inspired you, and who you read?
Well, my poetry journey has been probably the most important journey in my life, as we all have many journeys. As a child in Colombia, when I was growing up, my grandfather was the main person in my life as far as art and poetry were concerned. So from a very young age, he taught me about poetry. He read poems to me. He had me memorize poems and recite them to him as well. So I was immersed fully in the world of poetry. Then I moved to the States and went through the academic institutions and studied, as you mentioned, I studied literature and so on and so forth. So I left creative writing to the side for a while. But it was always my first love, and I always wanted to return to it. After I had my second child, I thought, well, this is the time. If I don't do it now, when am I going to do it? I was already a professor teaching full-time at Shepherd University. So I started with a novel based or inspired by my family in Colombia, and went to Breadloaf. I was looking for a conference because, as we all know, writers, we live isolated lives, more so now than ever, unfortunately. But and so I was looking for my tribe. I was looking for a group of people I could communicate with and speak about art with. So I looked at different conferences and found two and chose Breadloaf, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, which fortunately chose me, accepted me as a new writer, as a young writer. And I went there with a novel. But while I was there, I switched to poetry. I just attending the lectures and the readings and meeting some of the fellow poets. I thought, what am I doing writing a novel? I'm a poet. So I went right back to poetry and wrote some terrible poems, probably because I had not exercised my poetry brain for many years. But then I stuck to it, and I kept on returning to Breadloaf when I could, and to other conferences, and that's when I got back into poetry. And now, of course, I'm fully married to poetry.
So within that, you have a poem in your book about Philip Levine. How did you meet him?
Well, I met Philip Levine. I am the assistant director for Breadloaf in Sicily, and I've been attending that conference even before I got on the staff. From the very first year, which really this year would be the 10th year. And one of the wonderful things for me with this conference, as I said, was meeting all these other writers. But in Sicily, I got to meet Philip Levine when he came as a special guest one year. and we hang out together. He and his wife Franny and I spent time in the small town in Sicily where we held the conference, and it was such a wonderful experience. It was as if we had known each other many years. We became just great friends overnight, and we had some wonderful conversations about poetry, drank some wonderful wine, shared meals, and he was just so special.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Those friendships are treasures.
Yeah, so I wrote this poem to honor him, and it's a poem that really talks about Italy and mentions Italy quite a lot. Yeah.
Tim.
You know, I want to ask you, how would you describe your poetry style?
Well, I think my poems tell stories, so therefore it's narrative. Of course I love language. I love language, and I love taste, smell, touch. I like the poem. The poem is a living thing, and
you love color. Colors all over your poems. It's just so beautiful.
The wall behind me. I mean, yeah, it is. And for instance, I have a poem about Artemisia Gentileschi, which is about painting. I have a couple of ekphrastic poems. I do love color very much, Tim, and so I tell stories, and for me, poetry is about memory, also, especially in this book. It's about remembering, putting things together the way that I experienced them as a child, but looking back as an adult. And so it's kind of a collage, I would say. That's how I would describe my poems.
So, you know, in terms of your narrative poetry, in your view of narrative poetry, what makes a narrative poem excellent? What brings it to the point where it's not just telling a story, but it's poetry and it's transcendent? And your poems do that, but how do they do that?
Thank you, Tim. I think this is what I believe. So the poem tells a story. The story that you are telling as a poet is important to you because it is your story. It's something that you have to tell. But in order for the poem to succeed, in my opinion, it needs to become important to the reader as well. And so you start narrating, you start telling a story. This happened to me. For instance, I have a poem about Sagrado Corazón de Jesús in Bogotá, which was a Catholic school I attended with my cousin for about a year. So I'm telling a story about, I went to this school, and it was an all-girls school, and my cousin used to drink the equivalent of moonshine before class. She was a bad girl. So that's the story, right? But that's just the story that many people could tell. So what makes it into the poem? So for me, that poem, what was crucial in that poem was telling the story about her suffering and about our isolation as young people. And so I focus on the detail of her taking a pin and just carving a heart on her wrist, which she actually did do. And just going on and on with this pin until she got the scar. And that scar symbolized so many things that happened afterwards for me. And I mentioned, you know, she became pregnant as a teenager and then married later and so on and so forth. So I feel the responsibility to make the reader care. And since we have all experienced suffering in this beautiful world of ours, it doesn't all have to be about suffering, but it has to be an element of, some people call it surprise, some people call it the turn in the poem, something that, a nugget, a revelation, even if it's a vulnerable revelation. I think that is what makes a story in a narrative poem work for me.
Oh, that's a beautiful response. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your collection, Esperanza and Hope, and maybe read a couple poems there?
Yes, of course. So Esperanza and Hope is divided into three sections. I was born in Colombia, so I honor my birth and heritage, Colombian heritage, in the first section. The second section is about Europe. I lived 9 years in Italy, and I love Italy. It's my second home, and was my first home for for many years. And so I honor Italy, and in these two sections, even in the third section, which is about the U.S., which is also a love of in my life because my father was American, my husband, my first husband, and my third husband are American or is American, depending on how you look at it. But so I have a love relationship with these three places because my poetry is also about place and language tied to place. So it's divided into three parts. Each part has poems related to the geography and to the feeling of being in that place. And then it ends with a poem about the discovery of who Esperanza really is. And also, sorry, but it's about self-discovery and about asking who am I and who have I become. And that's very closely tied to name, to my name, Esperanza or Hope. So I will read a poem from the two poems right now. I'll read one from the Colombian section, and I think I might actually read the poem that I just mentioned, the one I just described about my cousin, to see what you think. The year I live with my cousin, it's titled. She shortens her uniform skirt and during recess at Sagrado Corazon drinks aguardiente and coke she brings from home. At 16, she has a woman's body, wide hips, a short frame she carries on platform shoes, clunky like geisha sandals. This is the year of our first boyfriends, the Mustafa brothers, Palestinian exiles studying Spanish in college. This is the year before I leave for Maryland to meet my brother and mother, the year before my cousin becomes a mother. Using a safety pin, she traces the shape of her heart on her wrist over and over again until blood stains her blouse. This is how you do it, she tells me, licking her skin, wiping the stain with a tissue. It hurts, but you get used to it. So that's one Colombian poem. And then the other one, I think, to honor my grandfather, whom I mentioned earlier, without whom I would not be here. By the way, he's up here. I put his picture there just to have him with me while I spoke to you guys. My grandfather loved many poets, but Garcia Lorca was one of his favorite poets, Pablo Neruda and Garcia Lorca. So this is a Lorca poem for my grandfather. Lorca and my grandfather. The day they died, large stars of frost came with the fish of shadows to open the way for dawn. They left three-piece suits in their closets, handmade hats on the shelves, books of poems. Con la sombra en la cintura, ella sueña en su baranda. Green are the words in my grandfather's mouth, green his emeralds, green the veranda in his house. He put his fingers in his vest pocket, unfolded paper squares and triangles for emeralds, green like mountains. Verde que te quiero verde, verde viento, verdes ramas. Blue, my father's eyes, white his lipstick-stained shirt, drying on the clotheslines. Green, my mother's jealousy, red her anger. She leans on the green veranda, counting bells as they chime. Verde carne, pelo verde, ojos de fría plata. Sunday mornings she kisses a worn-down crucifix by her bed, scrambles eggs with her fingers, refuses to go to church. Green is her newfound sadness that tastes of copper and dirt. Green her words, like Lorca's branches. Green, the lady of death. Bajo la luna gitana, Las cosas le están mirando y ella no puede mirarlas. Now they're gone. My country is no longer my country. My house, no longer my house. I look for them in the branches, green with sadness. Alone on the green veranda since I was a child. How long I waited for them, clean face, green hair. How long I waited, crying, with sugar cubes in my mouth. This country is no longer my country. This house is no longer my house. Verdes. Los quería verdes. Verde esmeralda. Verde esperanza.
What a poem. That's beautiful.
Thank you. Now the lines in Spanish, except for the last lines I read, are from Lorca. So they're borrowed from Lorca from his Romancero Gitano. So.
Wow.
Brother Al.
Yes. You know, Lorca's one of my my favorites. Some people translate Lorca better than others, but he's so alive. Let's talk a little bit about revision, because for many folks that is very important. How much revision do you use, and when do you know a poem is finished?
You know, that's a great question. All of us who write know how important revision is. I use a lot of revision. I was fortunate enough for years. Stanley Plumley, one of my mentors, passed away last May. But for years, I used to write poems and then send them to Stanley. And Stanley would read them. And I used to send the self-addressed stamped envelope with the poem. He would read them, make his comments, and then mail them back to me. And he taught me a lot about revision, and I learned from him. And what he would do to my poems mostly was cancel words. But it takes, you know, to get to that, we have to read, I mean, sometimes hundreds of times, right? To make sure that that's what we want to do. I read out loud. I read my poems out loud. And some of the poems in this book, just to tell you about revision, were written 20 years ago. And I've gone back to them. I've rewritten them completely, some of them, and others I've just kept on editing. And it's very interesting because, as you know, sometimes one word, when you're almost done with the poem, and there's one word that you add or that you edit, and the poem feels finished to me. So there are poems I still have in a box somewhere that have never been finished or complete, and they probably shouldn't be at this point if I haven't been able to go back to them. But I think for me the poem feels finished when I feel I have done everything to render it as perfect as it can be.
That's wonderful. Wonderful explanation of it. The do you steer a poem, or does the poem steer you? And what poets are you reading that stir your imagination?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I want to steer a poem. I want to steer all my poems, but some of my poems actually steer me. It depends, you know. Sometimes the poem, you think the poem is a child, and you are going to tell him or her what to do. This is what I want from you. This is how you need to behave, and this is that I would like. I want to come up with this amazing image, and that's why I'm giving you all these instructions. But you know, the child misbehaves, and then a dialogue begins, and you need to listen. You need to listen to the work as well. I mean, it is a discovery. To me, it's a discovery. Sometimes it's a mystical experience. I have sat down and I have written poems without hardly any revision, and some of them are among my best poems, which baffles me. I mean, I'm awed and I'm grateful for that inspiration. Other poems take a lot longer and don't succeed. I'll give you an example. I met a wonderful sculptor in New Mexico, in Taos, New Mexico. His name is John Suazo. And someone told me to go in there and interviewing him about his sculptures, and I did, and it was a wonderful trip, an amazing experience. And then I decided that I was going to write some poems inspired by his sculptures. So here I am. I have this clear plan. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write poems that reflect the beauty of his sculptures. My poems are just going to be as amazing, I hope, as his sculptures. Well, you know, I have not been successful because I think I've been trying too hard and trying to use a language that is not my own language and it's not my own experience. So I really actually have been working on these poems probably the last 6 months, and I'm about ready to move on to something else because I realized that it's not my poem to, my story to tell or my poem to write. As much as I love the experience of being there with him and it touched me and I wanted to communicate that, but maybe poetry is not the way to do it. Maybe it should be prose, you know.
And maybe like wine, it just wasn't ready to be uncorked.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Good point.
So, will you read a couple more poems for us?
Oh, I would be delighted.
As will we.
Thank you. You mentioned wine, so maybe I'll read a wine poem. I love wine, and I love Italian wine. And during the 9 years I lived in Italy, I learned a little bit about wine. And now I know a little bit about Spanish wines as well. But I think it's a wonderful, wonderful elixir. So here's a poem titled Memory in the Wine. This strip, this seat, this wine, this bottle, this wine, this sleep, this empty heart, this love quickly crawling, light floating outside the window of the plane, this silence, this glass, this trembling. That is where I lie on the bed by the wall, next to a window in the first light. How soon, how well should a man and a woman make love? How soon, how well have I loved? On the bed, on the couch, on the couch, on the bed. Love in a train wreck, love like a cold bath. Love like a brimming purse and a brimming purse heavy and overpowering. This strip, this seat, this wine, this torture, this book, this poem in a book, this wine on the tongue, this memory in the wine. But I didn't answer your question about, thank you. I didn't answer your question about the poets I am reading, and so I will answer that now. One of my favorite poets is Jack Gilbert, and I was introduced to Jack Gilbert by Steve Orland. When I met Steve Orland at Bread Loaf, and we worked together for a little while, and reading my poems, he said, you need to read Jack Gilbert. So I read Jack Gilbert, and I understood why Steve wanted me to read Jack Gilbert. I fell in love with his work. And part of it is the experience, the fact that he lived in Europe for so long, and the way he wrote about Europe, beautifully about Greece, and so on. So I can read a poem that I wrote with a line by Jack Gilbert that I have with me. I also like Larry Levis very much. And I was thinking in the poem for Phil Levine, I have a poem dedicated to Larry Levis, and then we had conversations about Larry Levis, and I love his long lines, but I also love the way his poems meander in just beautiful ways that I would love to be able to do myself in my poetry. So this is a poem that has, it was published by the South Florida Poetry Journal. It's not in the book, but it's titled Wings, and it says, with lines from Jack Gilbert. That May, on the airplane to Milan, my thoughts turned to leaving, to cutting ties, lies, burning letters. Flying into Malpensa Airport, I flew into a new life, a new love. Tuscan mornings, I opened windows to a sea of vineyards, a sweet scent of grapes ripening, the gentleness in me like deer standing in the dawn mist. Summer afternoons, I took my daughter to the pool, watched her float in armbands. Chlorine on our skin, water all around us, Petrarch's cypress trees lining the road, the Tuscan sky above us. She learned to swim her first summer on earth. I dreamed of giving her wings like Daedalus gave his son. Who knew Icarus would plunge into the sea, searching for freedom? Who knew that after 9 Tuscan summers, love fading out of me, my thoughts would turn to living, to taking airplanes, a suitcase, and a child? Everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. I like Adelia Prado, Brazilian writer, uh, excellent writer. Also, Wendy Guerra, who is a Cuban poet living in Cuba, and I actually translated 2 of her poems that came out in Poetry Northwest. She's an interesting poet. Marini, also Alda Merini, an Italian poet. So I like, as you can see, I like the language is tied to it. Wendy writes in Spanish, Alda Merini writes in Italian. I love English. I mean, I write in English, so obviously that's a tribute to this language, which I really love.
Your writing process. Are you a morning writer, afternoon writer? Do you like to write after a glass of wine? Do you write with a pen and a pad? How do you do your craft? And what are the craft, when you do it, what are the craft elements you like to use? What are the elements you like to avoid?
Well, that would take about several hours to answer. That's an excellent question. I am a morning writer. I write best in the morning, early in the morning. I use my computer, but I print hard copies. I have to read the hard copies of the poems, and I'm working on the memoir currently, and so I print out the chapters and have to read them on the hard copy, make the corrections, and then go back to the computer and edit. I can write after a glass of wine because I don't see why not, but I don't know how good the writing is. Well, maybe after 1 glass of wine, it's fine. But, after 2 glasses of wine, I think so many things will be needed. But the feeling of creating is just wonderful. In the morning, it's the structure, the schedule, I want to do this, I choose to do this before life takes over the rest of my life. Writing a poem after a glass of wine is just a wonderful experience. So I do both. Now, for the other part of your question, you were saying, what is it that I don't?
The craft elements you tend to avoid, but also the craft elements you use, your go-to elements.
Right. So I do not like too much repetition, only if it makes sense. And we know in poetry, I don't write rhyming poems, but the language is very important. But I'm very careful about repeating something unnecessarily unless there is, and for instance, in the Lorca poem, the cadence and the musicality and paying homage to Lorca, who actually repeated in his poetry. But I'm careful about use. Diction is very important to me. And initially, I was trained as a professor, as you both know, and an academic. And so I really had a difficult time with Spanglish because I, of course, studying Spanish medieval literature and so on, the spoken quote unquote language and the Spanglish, I really had trouble with. So the poet in me was the part of me that embraced it and that opened that door of, it was a door that was closed, and I just didn't like reading poetry that had verses in other languages. So it was it took a huge effort for me to say, wait a minute, language is language. Like, it's everywhere. It's who you are. You're three languages. I am three languages. I cannot imagine what the world would be like for me if I spoke only one language. I think I would lose some important parts of myself. So this is something that I didn't like, that I actually rejected, that I had to question, and I had to say, that's not right. And so it was very difficult for me to incorporate Spanish or Italian into my poetry in English. That was difficult because I didn't want it to be in some poetry. I have seen it happen where it's a device. It just sounds really cool, and it's just really neat. And I just didn't want that. I wanted to avoid that. And so I had to work really hard in order to make choices as to when do I include Spanish, and what is it that needs to be said in Spanish that cannot be said in English. And so that for me became a growth experience as a poet, and also as a human being. So that's one thing that I've worked through, and that has challenged me. I love. We were saying I love all colors, and I love metaphor, image. For instance, in the Lorca poem, and I also, I know there's been many conversations about the truth of the poem, and I remember hearing another interview you gave to Barrett Warner, where he was talking about that as well. And for instance, in the Lorca poem, for me, it's important that there is some truth. And how I arrive at that truth, obviously, it doesn't have to be the literal truth, because otherwise you can write a newspaper article, right? But how do you capture that? For me, in the Lorca poem, it was using the color green, and then the emeralds and the branches, and so building it up. I think that's something that I use that really works for me.
No, that's a wonderful response, and one of the things that I think I've asked almost every poet this question is, what advice would you give to the emerging poet about working through the frustration of being mediocre, of working hard on reading everything you can, writing as much as you can to get better, and still not having early success, but working through that? And what happens to advice too that you can offer about when you get success, how to let that ego really react to that success in the appropriate way?
Well, the first thing, of course, you mentioned reading everything you can. True. Also, reading outside of your comfort zone, as I was saying before, with an open mind. Writing as much as you can as well. I think you need to develop a writing practice, and whether the writing, and you need to honor the writer in you, the artist in you. And I think that's something that a lot of us don't do. My own story, as I'm saying it, is I had to come back to poetry. I had to come back to what I really cared about in my life, other than my family and my children, which was my art. And it took me years. So nurture the artist in you. Be open to experimenting. Don't get set. Don't say, I'm only going to be a poet, or I'm only going to be a novelist, or I'm only going to write memoir, because what you have to say could take many forms. I think it's more important to honor the creativity and to keep the creativity going than it is to set limits for yourself, especially at a young age. Find people who are talented and challenge you, people you admire. If at all possible, find a mentor or two who are hard on you when they have to be hard on you. You don't need people stroking your ego and telling you, this is great stuff, and then you put it in your drawer and so on. So I think find people who are good at their craft, who are willing to be tough with you when you need to hear it, and to spend time talking about writing and about art. For me, since I lived, I live in West Virginia, in Shepherdstown, and I've lived here for many years, and I felt isolated. So if you feel isolated, once things go back to normal, which we hope will be soon, the writers' conferences really worked for me. And I'm not saying, we know there are people who are professional attendees of writers' conferences, and that's terrific. That's wonderful. If you go attend every single writers' conference that you're able to, wonderful. But what matters is what you choose to attend, and to give it all you have when you do attend. Don't be too hard on yourself. Be hard only when you have to be. But also, you have to be willing, and you are both, I'm sure, going to agree with this, you have to be willing to take rejection. And you have to be willing to take advice. If you just wrote a line that you think is the most amazing line that has ever been written, and 2 or 3 of your friends who are writers and whom you trust tell you that it's not, you do have to listen. Or you should, anyway. I think persistence is important. The arts, this is a very competitive field. We know there are so many talented, so many gifted writers out there, but we all have something to share that we should share, that we feel the need to share. So I think we need to focus on not comparing ourselves so much to who is out there and so is getting their poem published in this magazine and this other person did so well, but on what we're doing. That brings me to, of course, we want other people to read our work. Of course, we want to get published. I think once success comes, Tim, for me, it came in a strange way, which is this book finally, I think I had been sending this book out, this manuscript out, I don't know, at least for years, let's say at least 2 or 3 years, in different forms, with different titles, you know, everything that I could do to see what would make the message clear to the editors and so on, contests also, all kinds of contests. And so I had been sending it out, and Grace Cavalieri, who's a terrific poet, she's been a wonderful person to poets and to young poets. She's the Poet Laureate of Maryland currently, and she interviewed me for The Poet and the Poem for the Library of Congress. And afterwards she said, well, you really need to send this book out. Come on, you haven't done enough, Hope. And that, you know, that was fair. That's when you listen to your mentors. And so I got a list of publishers, and I read the first 2, and I liked the first 2 I liked. I decided to send the book to. And lo and behold, Stanley Moss called me, and about 4 weeks later, and said, Esperanza, I want to publish your book. And I couldn't believe it, because I had been waiting for so long. So what happens when success comes? Well, I'll tell you what happened to me. Be prepared to work more and to work harder. Because it's you when you're expecting it, you think, oh, this is what I'm going to attain or achieve. And then when I do get my book published, people are just going to see that I'm a poet, and I'll feel, you know, I'm a poet and so on. But really, you've been a poet all along. You'll continue to be a poet. You continue to have the same challenges or different challenges, but you will be challenged. You have to be ready to continue writing, honoring yourself. And in this day and age, we all know we have to do everything we can to promote our own work. And it's not easy. We do what we can, but the work comes first. That's what I would suggest. I'd say success is an interesting word. It's an interesting word. But I think that success for all of us is personal. And I think for me, success is continuing to write, continuing to get up every morning and sit down and think about what I'm going to write about, and then trying to be part of a writer's community and sending my work out.
Esperanza, that's a stunning answer. It's so wonderful. Brother Al.
Actually, I want to ask you, what resources would you recommend to a poet who's just starting out, or even to an established poet who sometimes you just need a resource? You know, you're questioning yourself, or you're wanting to find more. Do you have resources that you recommend?
If you mean, I mean, I think it's important to have readers, because if you're questioning yourself, we all are and do at times, or some of us all the time. But I think a support system is important. Some people have writing groups, if that works for you. Some people, as I said, what has worked for me has been conferences, attending several conferences where I connected with people, with like-minded people, and we encouraged each other and we shared our work. I think that's important. I think there's a book, The Art of War, The War of Art. They take that Steven Pressfield wrote it, I believe, and it's I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's a terrific book, The War of Art, and it's about. I found that book inspirational. It's about getting out of our own way. It's about doing what we're supposed to do and what we were born to do and what we came here to do, which is write and embrace the writing and also the positive thinking about the writing. That's a book I highly recommend. It's a very short book, and I've read it several times, and it's really helped me. I also meditate. I meditate. I've been meditating for a few years now in the morning, and I feel that that's been very helpful because I think as artists, all the voices we have in our heads about this isn't good enough, or we can't, or what am I going to do? How am I going to be successful? Really interfere with the creative process. So I think separating the writing from the sending your poems out, send your work out as much as you can. Don't give up on doing that, but then separate the creative process from the managerial process or the poet or the writer in the world process. And you cannot give up on either. If you want the world to read your work, then you have to keep both up. And it's not easy, but it can be done. It can be done.
Thank you.
Esperanza, how can people get hold of your book? What's the best way to get hold of your collection?
Well, it's available on Amazon, and it's distributed through Syracuse University Press, I believe, but they do it through Amazon. And also Four Seasons Books in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is an independent bookstore, carries it. So that's how they could get a hold of it. Yes.
And would you read a couple more poems for us and for our listeners?
Of course, I would love to. I'm going to read two brief poems. One is dedicated to Alfonsina Storni, who was a poet who was born in Switzerland. She was of Italian descent, but she grew up in Argentina. She was one of my grandfather's favorite poets. She committed suicide at the age of, I think she was 48, and she did it by jumping into Mar del Plata or walking into Mar del Plata. And she had a very interesting life and some wonderful poems. So here's a poem, I Dream of Alfonsina Storni. And this poem describes her last night the way I imagined it to be from what I've read. In her hotel room, she's sitting at a desk, searching through her handbag for a pen, writing her last poem to be mailed to La Nación tomorrow morning. In her poem, she asks Death to tell him, if he calls again, that she's gone out. Why did you give the last two lines of your last poem to a man, Alfonsina? Didn't you once say you sold yourself for the city and its men and spent your life forgiving them? My last poem is titled Esperanza's Country. Once, in a cab in Paris, I let the driver think I was from Madrid. My ride was free. All those years trying to be Colombian, a waste. I am my own country.
That's very, very concise piece that just says much more than just those few lines.
That used to be a much, much longer poem. Speaking of revision,
Yes.
that poem was about 2 pages long.
Tim and I, we work together a lot on our poetry, and I'm more of a concision guy, and he's this great narrative writer. So I can appreciate that, and so can Tim. We want to thank you for being with us. This has been just a marvelous interview on Chewing the Gristle.
Thank you so much, Al and Tim. It was terrific to have this conversation, and I really admire what you guys are doing. Thank you for taking the voice of poetry out into the world, and for encouraging poets and writers, artists to keep on writing. And it's inspirational to see what you guys do. So thank you for having me.